now call Ross Greer to be followed by Michelle Thompson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And like colleagues, I'd like to pass on my and my party's congratulations to the Cabinet Secretary on her husband. I would also like to observe to Liz Smith that I've certainly been called many things in my political career. I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary has as well. But I'm intrigued by the notion that a process based in large part on dialogue between myself and Kate Forbes could be described as unholy. The Minister for Zero Carbon Buildings did observe to me a moment ago that perhaps if he'd been leading for the Greens in these discussions, unholy may have been a more apt description. The budget process in this Parliament is far more compressed than members and committees would like, as John Mason's just noticed. But even in the relatively brief period between publication of the first draft and this final debate, the world around us has, not for the first time, changed significantly. A global energy crisis and a complete failure on the UK Government's part to regulate our domestic energy market means that almost every household in Scotland faces a huge rise in our energy bills. For many, this will be completely unpayable. It will force families into crisis, and without radical action, as the Cabinet Secretary said at the weekend, the Cabinet Secretary for Energy said at the weekend, some people will die. But at the very same time, the very same energy companies whose gas runs through our network are laughing all the way to the bank, reporting billions of pounds in net profits. BP and Shell made a combined £44,000 of net profits a minute in 2021. With a single step, a windfall tax on the profits of oil and gas companies, the UK Government could raise the money needed to help families through this difficult period. And I hope that all parties in this Parliament and in Westminster recognise the growing public demand for this very just tax on obscene profits. I welcome the Finance Secretary's announcement today that the Scottish Government is doing what it can to support families, particularly given the revelation that the £290 million of additional funding the UK Government claimed was coming to Scotland largely doesn't exist. This is on top of the measures already in this budget which support family incomes. The doubling of the transformational Scottish Child Payment, free bus travel for young people, increasing funding for family income maximisation projects, increasing pay for care workers, delivering free school meals for all primary 1 to 5 pupils, and funding the capital investment needed to roll that out to primary 6 and 7 as soon as possible. On home energy and fuel bills in particular, I'm proud of the role that the Greens are playing in government to drive forward energy efficiency and decarbonisation programmes that will both reduce emissions and reduce household fuel bills. The £160 million already earmarked to support those who would otherwise be unable to pay for energy improvements for their homes will clearly be essential. And I hope the plans for deploying it are currently being revisited to ensure that money is going out the door and resulting in home energy improvements as soon as possible. Supporting people to pay their surging bills in the short term is obviously critical now, but this budget reflects the priority that we are putting on reducing the amount of energy people need to heat their home in the first place and decarbonising the sources of that energy. The new low-income winter heating assistance programme will also be hugely important this year. But again, I'd ask the Government to consider if plans for how it's deployed might be adapted to reflect the energy crisis that we now face. The Warmer Home Scheme is another whose importance is now far greater than previously envisaged, but given the circumstances, I think there's probably merit in revisiting and widening the eligibility for that scheme. Expanding the advice capacity of Home Energy Scotland would also seem sensible at this point. I say all of this knowing the huge pressure on the Scottish Government. The context of a 5% real terms cut from Westminster is still true. And the developments around this £290 million of money that never was has again demonstrated that the fiscal framework simply isn't working. And opposition parties have now proposed, I think, something in the region of £3 billion of additional spending. I think it's gone up in the course of this debate. But there's absolutely no credible accompanying proposals for where that money would come from. So I return to the point that I made during the rates resolution debate. We need to change how the budget is developed, scrutinised and debated in this Parliament. All parties should be given the opportunity to, all parties should be expected to, confirm at least some of their taxation proposals each year. Spending proposals without revenue raising or reallocation proposals should not be taken seriously. Yes.
Daniel Johnson.
I very much thank the member for giving one, and I agree with the need for a better budget proposal, but we also accept that if you look at last year's budget as passed, compared to the resource funding available this year, and if we assume correctly or that take on good faith that the government didn't use Barnett consequentials for COVID on recurring items, that left £3 billion difference unallocated going into the budget. Not more money than last year, but certainly £3 billion unallocated from last year's budget going into the current year's budget going into next year's budget.
Ross Greer.
I thank the member for the intervention, but I don't recognise his characterisation, both of the way that underspend is calculated, but also of the way COVID consequentials are deployed. There is a difference between one-off and recurring spending as a result of COVID. The example I gave during the Stage 1 debate was the amount of money that is having to be spent this year on keeping public transport operators continuing. Now, that goes into our core funding. We hope that will not be needed on a recurring basis, but it's certainly needed this year, and it comes out of the core budget as a result of the COVID consequentials for it being withdrawn. I think all parties putting forward at least some spending proposals, some taxation-raising proposals rather, would be better for government and for opposition in the course of this debate. But this budget, I think I'm about to close.
There's a wee bit of time in hand, should you wish to take the intervention.
In that case, yes, please.
Elizabeth.
I thank Mr Greer for taking the intervention. Is he in favour of going back to a system where we have 3-year projections on budgets, and would he also agree to the possibility of a finance bill that is better in terms of scrutinising where expenditure lies?
Ross Greer.
Thank you, and I'm grateful to the member for that intervention. I think, and someone can intervene to correct me if I'm wrong, I think all parties in this Parliament would prefer if we were able to do multi-annual budgeting. I think 3-year budgeting is something that we would all support if we were in the position to do that. We're in the position this year as a result of the UK spending review that we can look a little bit further forward. If we had more certainty from the UK Government, I would certainly strongly support 3-year budgeting, but that's not possible under the current arrangements that this Parliament faces on an annual basis. This budget, though, is based on 3 strategic choices made by the Scottish Government. That's why the Greens are supporting it. Those are choices made in the programme for government and in the cooperation agreement between our parties which underpin it. We've chosen to tackle child poverty, climate action and COVID recovery as those shared strategic objectives. That's reflected, for example, in the £150 million for active travel, the £300 million for bus services, the £6 million for the Climate Justice Fund, £200 million for tackling the poverty-related attainment gap. The Greens are proud to vote for a budget that reflects these strategic priorities, and we would urge all parties in this Parliament to seriously consider what they might be voting against at decision time. Thank you.
Thank you.